Today I want to tell you a Christmas story that you may not have heard before. It's called The Story of the Other Wise Man. It was written by a Presbyterian minister whose name was Henry Van Dyke. He was also, of course, a person who wrote some short stories. He graduated from Princeton University and Princeton Seminary, and then he went on to serve some churches before he went back to Princeton to preach. One of the churches that he served was Brick Presbyterian Church, which is in New York City. Some of you may have visited there when you are in New York. Here's the way the story goes. You know that there are traditionally 3 of the wise men. Now you know that's not in the Bible. The only thing in the Bible about the wise men is that they brought 3 gifts. But we somehow imagine there must have been 3 different people in order to bring those 3 gifts. The story that Reverend Van Dyke wrote goes like this. There was also a 4th wise man. These were all people who were astronomers, astrologers, who could read the stars and know what was about to happen because they looked at the stars. They knew in about the year 0 AD, the way we count the years, that something great was going to happen in the area of Judea, near Jerusalem, maybe south of Jerusalem. They knew, in fact, that someone who would be called King of the Jews would be born because of the way they interpreted the stars and read the ancient manuscripts. These 4 people lived in different places, but they had made a pact that when a certain thing happened in the sky, they would meet at a certain place and then travel together to Judea to witness this great event that had happened. So Artaban, the other wise man, watched and waited. And while he prepared for this great journey that he would take, he sold everything that he owned in order to buy 3 great gifts that he would take to this king who was to be born. He bought a huge sapphire, a big ruby, and a pearl beyond price, a large pearl that he could take with him. So he had his gifts ready. He had sold everything he had. He was ready to take off and travel across the desert. And then one night, he saw the thing that he was looking for. The sign appeared in the sky. And so he gathered together his treasures and gathered together his camels and all of the things he had ready to go and started off for the place where he was to meet the other wise men. He was riding a horse on his way there, and on the way, on a dark path, his horse shied, and he realized that there was something wrong. He eventually had to get off the horse because the horse would not proceed along the path any further. When Artaban got down, he found that there was a man who had been horribly injured, who was laying there in the road. Artaban at first imagined that the man was dead, and he went to close his eyes and to cover his face. And then the man reached out and took a hold of him and made a sound. Artaban now knew that there was a dilemma here, because if he waited to take care of this man, he would be too late to reach his friends. He couldn't do what he intended. He couldn't go to see the King of the Jews. He'd get stuck here taking care of this guy he'd never met, and maybe he couldn't even help him anyway. But his kinder nature took over, and he stopped, and he ministered to the man. He fed him. He gave him water to drink. He stayed with him through the night until he could tell that the man could make it on his own. In the night, he told the man the story of what he was doing, where he was going. And the man said to him, "Now, just wait a minute. You're headed to the wrong place if you are headed to Jerusalem, you and your friends. Because I am a Hebrew, and I know how to interpret the scriptures, and I'll tell you that King of the Jews is going to be born in Bethlehem, not Jerusalem." Well, Artaban took care of the man and then got back on his horse and rode as fast as he could to meet his friends. But of course, he was too late when he arrived. They had left him a note. They were already gone across the desert without him. He knew he couldn't travel across the desert on his own. He would have to form a caravan of his own to go across that big desert. And so he turned around and went back to a city where he could put a caravan together. He spent his sapphire in order to buy all the provisions that he needed. But he did make it to Bethlehem with his caravan. He got there and began asking about his friends because they would have stood out in a crowd at Bethlehem. Everyone would have known that they had been there. He was told that his friends had just left a few days earlier, and in fact they had not gone back to Jerusalem as they had said they might, but instead kind of snuck out of Bethlehem and took off in a different direction. But he was also told that the baby whom they had visited and his parents had also left Bethlehem, and in fact they had gone down into Egypt. So Artaban decided he should rest for a day or two and then take off toward Egypt to find this new king who had been born. He still had 2 gifts, after all, to deliver to him. Just then, as he arrived at the door of someone else of whom he was going to ask some directions, they heard a great commotion in the street. The house in which he then was actually the house of a young woman and her new baby boy. As Artaban began to investigate what was happening in the street, he saw that the soldiers were coming down the street, and he heard the cries going up from household after household. He realized that the soldiers were killing the babies every place they found, any child under the age of 2. What was he to do with this young woman whom he had met, who had been kind to him, and her little boy? So Artaban told the woman to keep the baby quiet, and he stood in the doorway when the soldier approached. He said to the soldier, "There are no children here." The soldier said, "Step aside, let me search for myself." And then Artaban held out his hand with a huge ruby in it and said to the soldier, "There are no children here." The soldier pocketed the ruby and said to his troops, "Move on. We don't need to go into this house." Now Artaban was down to just the pearl, but he still wanted to deliver that to the great king, and so he went down into Egypt, and he searched and searched. He searched among the poor, he searched among people who needed help, and every place he went in Egypt, and when he got back to Judea, he was kind of following in the footsteps of the one for whom he was searching. He took care of people when he found them when they were hungry. He gave them drink when they were thirsty. He even shared some of his clothes with them when he found people who needed that. 33 years after his search began, Artaban was now an old man. He was in Jerusalem at the time of the Passover among all of those crowds of people who had gathered there, and he heard a rumor about something, and he thought maybe perhaps he had finally found the one for whom he had been searching. A rumor about a rabbi from the north who had changed people's lives. Simply by being in his presence, they had become new people. He had healed them, he had fed them, he had taken care of them, and made them new people. Surely this was the one for whom he had searched. Then he heard that this very man had been arrested, and that he was being taken out to be put on a cross so that he would die at the edge of town. And Artaban tried to make his way through the crowd so that he could get there before that death happened. But as he was going down the street that Jesus had just gone along himself, there was a woman being shoved along by the soldiers coming toward him. She was crying out to the crowd around her, "Help me, help me! They're going to put me in jail because of my family's debts. My father can't pay, I can't pay. I'll go to jail for the rest of my life if we can't pay our debts." And once again, Artaban was trapped by his heart. He knew he needed to hurry if he were to see Jesus, but here was a young woman who needed his help. And so he reached into his robes and took out the last of his treasures, gave it to the soldiers, this pearl of great price, to buy her freedom. Just then, the sky grew dark and an earthquake happened. An earthquake so shattering that it made tiles move off the roof. It was the earthquake at the moment of Jesus' death. One of those tiles slid off the roof above him and hit his head and knocked him to the ground. The people around him could tell that this man would not recover from this injury. And just as Artaban was slipping away and thinking, "I have wasted my life. I never got to see the King of the Jews. I never got to see the one who changed all these people's lives. I never got to give him my gifts," Artaban heard a voice that said to him, "I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was naked, and you helped me. I was in peril, and you stayed with me. Even as you did it to the least of these, you did it unto me." Artaban went to his death, knowing that instead of wasting his life and losing the gifts he intended for the king, he had indeed spent them in exactly the way the king would have intended, bringing hope into people's hopeless lives.